Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to another episode of Glam Metal Gems, number 9. So this is a series where I like to take a deeper look into the genre and albums that were released. There's so many great ones that flew under the radar and just kind of slipped through the cracks and really weren't given the attention that they deserved. And so hopefully with this series here, we can shine a bit of a light onto these lost glam metal gems, if you will, and bring them to a wider audience. So we're going to do that. We've got 5 of them to run through, but before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things do help. And of course, if you turn on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on really cool videos just like this with Glam Metal Gems and episode number 9. All right, so as I like to do, we're going to run through these by year of release. So no real particular order because they are all standout albums in my opinion, and you should check them all out if you got the time to. First one up, Beggars and Thieves, self-titled release from 1990. There's the backside of it. Came out on Atlantic Records. This one here was a debut, and they did release some more. I'll talk about that in just a minute. This band featured a lineup of Louis Merlino on vocals, Ron Mancuso on guitar, who would later play with Jake E. Lee in the band Red Dragon Cartel, Phil Soussan on bass, and he came from Ozzy Osbourne's band, played on The Ultimate Sin. We all have Bobby Borg is on drums on here. He'd later go on and play with Warrant and in a band called Left for Dead. So a lot of cool guys within the ranks here making up pretty cool lineup. Now again, a lot of this is us looking back on these bands. So at the time, maybe not, having that pedigree yet, but when we look back at these, a lot of cool guys and where they come from. This here's kind of more melodic rock than the straight up glam metal sound of the day, but very good stuff, worth checking out. The single No More Broken Dreams was their sort of hit off of the album. I'd recommend checking that out. It's track number 1 on here. As I mentioned, they did put out some other stuff, 4 albums in all. They followed it up with the Gray album, and these are later releases. So, the band I think disbanded at this time and then would later in the mid 90s to late 90s come out. Like this one here is 1997. This one here, Look What You Create. And then their latest album from 2011, We Are the Broken Hearted. Very cool. Sort of comeback album, if you will. And the 2 key people here are the vocalist and guitar player who have stayed with the lineup, and then the other guys, have changed over the years, stuff like that. But Louis Merlino and Ron Mancuso. So definitely a good band, worth checking out. Next one I want to talk about here is Hurricane Alice, Tear Down the House from 1990. Another Atlantic Records release. Atlantic Records did so much good for glam metal bands and stuff like that. I guess the owner of the company was just also into that or knew what its capabilities were. But this one's a cool one here. Bruce Newman on vocals, Danny Gill on guitar, who would play with Mark Ferrari, Mark Ferrari of Keel, who would later have a band called Medicine Wheel, and that's where Danny Gill would join him and play. But the reason that I knew about this album was because of Ian Mayo on bass and Jackie Ramos on drums, who both played with a group called Bangalore Choir. And I've talked to you guys a lot about this band here. In fact, these guys were covered in an earlier episode of Glam Metal Gems. But I really wanted to focus here on Hurricane Alice. And notice how it's spelled. In fact, I'm going to flip it over because it's larger here. H-E-R, as in like the girl. And that's why it's Hurricane Alice. So spelled differently than the regular spelling of the word hurricane with the U. But sometimes that can make it difficult to find, so I like to point that out. But again, really good, interesting glam metal sound that's here on this, and a lot of cool players within the lineup of this group. Originally, the vocalist was going to be David Reese from Accept, who, as I mentioned, in this band, David Reese was from this band here. So there's another connection between Ian Mayo and Jackie Ramos and why they ended up in David Reese's band, Bangalore Choir. But he was originally going to sing for this, but his band at the time was starting to take off and was going to tour and so forth, and so he opted not to join and went and pursued that. The amazing thing is that for the longest time, this was the one and only album that the band put out, but I just found it by pure accident looking up on Apple Music that they dropped an album in 2020. So an album 30 years after this one, and I don't think it's a brand new recorded album, even though they call it a new album. I think this is something that was recorded back in the day and only just getting a release. I could be wrong, but there wasn't really a lot of information on it out on the internet for me to see. But if you're interested in a second album by Hurricane Alice, it's called Gotta Be Real, and as I said, came out in 2020. And I think that's just, a lot of bands did that during the pandemic, dropped unreleased albums and stuff like that, trying to bring in some extra income when they couldn't tour and do the normal things they could do. And so that was kind of a cool plus side to what was happening with the pandemic and everything. All right, next one to talk about, Trouble Tribe's self-titled album from 1990. There's the backside. You get to see all the cool guys in the group. I always liked that. This one here on Chrysalis Records. Debut album, and so far only one from them. And I like to preference that as so far because you never know when that unreleased second album or something might get dropped. I didn't recognize these guys' names, and there's not a lot of information out there about this band, but the guitar player, Adam Wacht, and again, I don't know if I'm saying that right. It is spelled W-A-C-H-T, Wacht. But he would play in the group Left for Dead, which was the band I mentioned earlier with Bobby Borg on drums. So nice little cross connection between some of the bands we're talking about today, pairing up in future lineups of other things. So this one here, I knew a couple singles off of it, got some MTV play and stuff like that. Here Comes Trouble and the song Tattoo. Both of those good songs. There was also a really great power ballad on here called In the End. So definitely worth checking out those three songs if you don't already know. But I have to say, the thing that caught my eye about this band early on was I had heard some stuff on the radio. Then, you're at the CD store and you're thumbing through the rack. And when you see the naked tattooed woman like this, and you're a young teenage boy, it's probably more the reason I was attuned to that album than anything else. But I have to point those kind of things out because a lot of times back in the day, the marketing, stuff like that, the album cover was a big thing that could draw people in. And hey, no shame in that. Naked lady always draws in the teenage boy, right? Okay, next one, and one of my favorite albums to come out of the glam metal era. Kind of surprised I didn't include it until now, but Contraband, their self-titled release from 1991, debut and only studio album to date, and they were a supergroup. And I always liked that about the front of this, where they had the cases, the musical cases that had the drums, the guitars, whatever in it, and you could see their logos stenciled on that there. And then of course on the backside we get to see all of the guys. And so we've got Richard Black on vocals coming from Shark Island, Michael Schenker on guitar, of course from MSG, UFO, Tracy Guns on guitar from LA Guns, Sheer Peterson on bass from Vixen, and Bobby Blotzer on drums from Rat. So quite the who's who, and it did get a lot of press at the time, but this band kind of came and went really fast because it was already 1991, and that was just the tail end of glam metal and everything. And I think, again, the band fell apart pretty quick. I know Michael Schenker left the group very quickly after doing it, as he does with a lot of projects and stuff, unfortunately kind of shooting himself in the foot with the his antics and stuff like that. But just a really solid album. It's mostly made up of cover songs and songs written by outside writers. Case in point, track number 1, All the Way from Memphis, is a Mott the Hoople song, and track number 4, Bad for Each Other, was a re-recording of the Shark Island song. In fact, since I mentioned, I might as well show you guys Shark Island release. I've covered this one in a previous Glam Metal Gems as well, but wanted to focus on this one now. So, if you, any cross connection like that, but I have to say, if you are a fan of Shark Island and you always wanted more in that same vein as this album, because they actually did do a couple albums before this and a couple after, but nothing really sounds this way. Contraband is about the closest thing you're going to get to it. So for me, at least, I can't listen to one without the other, as I just kind of consider them hand and foot, one of the same sort of thing. But I just think this is a really fun, good, strong hard rock glam metal album that's totally worth it for anyone to check out, even though there were covers and outside writers and stuff like that on it. Just very fun. Okay, and the last one to talk about is actually another one of my favorites from the era. The Scream, Let It Scream from 1991. We all know why we love this album, of course. There you go, John Corabi, who would go on to front Motley Crue. But there's a lot of other cool guys in the group. They were basically a little mini super group, if you will. So one and only album that's been released to date. I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a bit, but supergroup featuring John Corabi, as I mentioned. He would go on to Motley Crue, but he hadn't really made it. He had some other projects and things that he had done prior to this, but this was his first thing, and then Motley Crue made it the bigger thing. But we did have Bruce Boulay on guitar, and he came from Racer X. We also had John Alderant on bass from Racer X as well, but he would go on to play with Mars Volta and I think Marilyn Manson and a few others, and he'd play under his given name of Juan, but for this album here he is known as John. And then Walt Woodward III on drums, who played with Shark Island on an earlier release, School Bus, and the band Americade back in the very early 80s. So you had some really cool known people in the like shred world and stuff, and then they brought in John Corabi, and this album here just smokes from start to finish. I Believe in Me and Man in the Moon were the two really big ones that were all over radio, and I don't even know if I knew them from MTV per se, but I knew them from radio. I was definitely into this album. I had it, and when it was announced that he would be taken over for Vince Neil and Motley Crue, I was stoked because I loved what he did here. Now, of course, the Motley Crue album that would be recorded later on was a much more down and dirty, darker feeling album, but from what I was hearing on the Scream, he easily could have sung and done an album in the vein of what Vince Neil had done with Dr. Feelgood and stuff like that. That's just not where the band chose to go with it, but all in all, pretty cool. So the band did, as I mentioned, make one additional album. They recorded a follow-up album with vocalist Billy Fogarty. Unfortunately, it was shelved and has never been released, and I really wish they would put that out because this album here is so good. I would really like to hear what the band could do as a follow-up. Don't know if it would have sounded the same or not like that. Probably some stuff has leaked out, over the internet over the years and stuff like that. I haven't heard it yet, at least. But there you go. So that is Glam Metal Gems number 9. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Do check back. I try to do weekly episodes of this every Thursday, at least right now. We'll be doing that for a while as we slowly tick through a lot of these lost gems as I try to shed some light on it. Hopefully open you guys up to some of these, or at least remind you of great albums that maybe have sat on your shelf for too long and should be dusted off and listened to. All right, everyone, have a good one. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.